Hey everyone, welcome to this third episode of NGBE Live. In this episode, we have Manfred Steyer, who will be taking us on a journey through module federation with Angular. Welcome, Manfred.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So this is a very special episode because normally we have two speakers with two talks. Manfred, however, you submitted two. Sorry, I have an audio echo here. Let me fix that first. I'm constantly hearing myself, so I'll fix that first. All right, there we go. So sorry. So Manfred submitted two awesome talks, and we reached out to Manfred to see if he could make it one big in-depth session, and he agreed. So thank you so much for that, Manfred. Really looking forward to learning more today. But before we kick off, let's meet our panelists for today. We have Yannick Houbrix. We have Matt Carniatto. We have Maarten Tibau. And we have some Vloeberghs.
Hey.
Welcome all. Thanks for joining. So if you have ever been to an Angular conference before, you have probably already met Manfred. He is the gentle giant with the Austrian accent that always comes up with fascinating topics and answers all of our questions with a smile. Manfred is a trainer, a consultant, a programming architect with a focus on Angular. He's also a Google developer expert, an author, and a conference speaker. The implementation of micro frontends has not been easy so far because common frameworks and build tools were not aware of the concept at all. Module federation, which is now introduced with Webpack 5, changes all of this. It allows you to load separately compiled applications at runtime and share libraries between them. In the first half of this session, Manfred will teach us how to use this module federation to create micro frontends with Angular. We will learn about the default scenarios, about the dynamic module federation, about sharing libraries between them, and dealing with version mismatches. If that's not enough, in the second half of this section, Manfred will teach us about the plugin-based architectures. So he will take us on a workflow designer with individual workflow tasks that can be exposed via separate applications hosted on different origins and loaded in the workflow designer. If you already worked with loading stuff across origins, you know how hard that can be. And this will allow us to easily extend the designer without the need to recompile any of its parts. So really, really awesome. By the end of the episode, we will all know what module federation is and how we can use it in our projects together with the Angular CLI. Manfred has agreed to taking questions after his talk. So if you have any questions, please leave them in the YouTube live chat on the YouTube page. And if you like what you hear, please don't always hesitate to applaud there as well. With that, please give it up for Manfred Steyer.
Thank you. Okay, let's get started. So this will be about module federation, as mentioned before, which is quite a new topic. And I want to start with this very picture here. Perhaps you have seen this picture before. It's the helicopter from Leonardo da Vinci. This crazy guy, Leonardo da Vinci, designed the helicopter in 1400 something. 1400 something. He only designed it because he didn't have the right material for building it. But the thing is, scientists tried to build it several years ago, and they found out that it really flies. How cool is that? And this story reminds me somehow to micro frontends, because the idea has been around for several years, but there was not the right material for building it. But what do I think when talking about micro frontends? Well, I think about a big software system which is subdivided in tiny parts. And those parts are individual applications. That means you can assign one theme to all of those applications. For instance, one theme to the booking application, one theme to the luggage application, one theme to the boarding application, one theme to the check-in application. You don't go with a big overall flight management system, as you might call this, but you have a lot of tiny applications. And so they can work individually. They don't need to coordinate much with each other. and they can do their own decisions, technology-wise and architecture-wise. So this brings back a lot of flexibility, a lot of agility. But the big question that arises when doing something like this is how to integrate all those tiny applications that have been developed and deployed separately, how to integrate them into a bigger solution. Because what the user wants to have is one big solution like this here in the middle, like I call it a shell which is capable of loading this micro front end, loading that micro front end from a given location. So at the end of the day, it should look like an integrated solution for the user, but from our perspective, from the perspective of programmers, it is just a bunch of little tiny applications. This was not really possible before. I mean, yeah, it was possible, but you needed a lot of workarounds for doing this. But this is changing now, because module federation gives you an official way to load separately compiled stuff, separately deployed stuff into your shell. And this is what this talk will be about. In this talk, I will tell you about several things. We will start with module federation in general. I will show you what module federation is about and how we can use it. We will also look into how to combine it with Angular. We will also talk about something I'm calling dynamic module federation. That means we don't know about our micro frontends upfront. We only know about them at runtime. We get some data, some metadata about it, and then we can load this or that micro frontend in a very dynamic way. We will talk about version mismatches. We will talk about the communication between micro frontends and about what I'm calling multi-framework, multi-version micro frontends. This is a brand new topic, and I've got a lot of questions about this recently, and that's why I decided to include this topic on short notice in this talk. And at the end, I will also give you an overview about a possible roadmap. But first, let me introduce myself. I am Manfred. I'm doing a lot of trainings and workshops. For instance, this workshop here, which is about Angular in the enterprise environment, which is my main topic, how to use Angular for big enterprise scale architectures. And besides this, I'm also quite connected to the Angular community. I live in Austria. This is also where my accent comes from. I'm doing a lot of stuff in Germany, and I'm always happy if I can work together with people around the world, for instance, in Belgium. So let's get started with Webpack in general. The main question Webpack module federation is answering is this one here: how to load separately compiled code. And perhaps you say now, hey, Manfred, come on, that cannot be that difficult, because why not just take a dynamic import? Why not use this dynamic import to point over to another application? Why not to load this application on demand with it? Well, in theory, this works perfectly. In practice, this does not work at all because of limitations of current bundlers like Webpack, for instance. And we all know the CLI is using Webpack underneath the covers, and so the CLI also have the same limitations. Why do we have these limitations? Well, all those bundlers, including Webpack, assume that everything is there at compile time. Everything needs to be known at compile time. Everything is compiled together. Everything is optimized together. Think about tree shaking, for instance. And then, and only then, it is cut into pieces for lazy loading. But this is too late, because we don't know everything upfront when going with micro frontends. Everything is separately compiled, everything is separately deployed, and so the first time we know our stuff is at runtime. This was a big issue in the past. Of course, as always, we found some dirty workarounds to bypass those limitations, but there haven't been a sound solution for this. And this is changing now with Webpack 5 and module federation. To make this possible, module federation introduces two roles. The first role is the host, and the second role is the remote. I'm calling the host my shell, my micro frontend shell, and I'm calling the remote my micro frontend that is loaded into the middle of the shell. With module federation, we can configure both roles. For instance, we can say, hey, the shell knows this URL that is called MFE1, which stands for micro frontend 1. It's very creative, I know. And always when using this URL, please point over to this separately compiled micro frontend. And by the way, what's called MFE1 here, it's also called MFE1 over there. This would allow me to define an alias. Here it is a non-alias to be more precise, because I'm saying, hey, it's called MFE1 here, and it's also called MFE1 over there. Over there, we can expose files. We can say, hey, let's expose this Ivy component or this function or this Angular module. You can expose everything. You can also import or export with TypeScript or ECMAScript. In this case, I'm exposing a component under this very name, CMB. And then something beautiful happens. I guarantee you will love it. Then you can use this very dynamic import using the mapped paths. The mapped paths from the left side, the mapped paths from the right side. And with this dynamic import, you can grab over to the micro frontend and load the exposed component from there. The best thing about this is that Angular does not even recognize this. For Angular, this is just traditional lazy loading. Angular does not know about module federation, and it does not know about micro frontends. It is just doing what it is doing all the time. It is displaying an application, and sometimes it's performing lazy loading. That's really beautiful, because that means you don't need a meter framework for loading different single-page applications called micro frontends. Webpack underneath the covers is taking care of all the heavy lifting of loading separately compiled stuff and of giving it to Angular. Of course, we need some metadata about the micro frontend, and that's why module federation is generating a special file when building the remote. This file is called the remote entry point. And this remote entry point needs to be loaded upfront into your shell. It should be loaded upfront into the shell so that the shell knows about this micro frontend, so that the shell knows about all the metadata, and so that the shell is capable of loading it on demand. You can do this with a dynamic script tag. As we will see in the course of this talk, there are even some more dynamic solutions for this. You don't need to hard code it. The best thing of this is that you can even share libraries. So let's say we have Angular on the left side. Let's say we have Angular on the right side. We can just share it. And in this case, Angular is only loaded once. Because obviously, when we have 10 micro frontends, we do not want to load Angular 10 times. That would be quite an overhead, wouldn't it? And so the ability of sharing stuff is really, really vital here. So this is the foundation and the theory behind module federation. Of course, now the big question that arises for us Angular developers is, how can we use this together with the CLI? This is a bit of a challenge, not a too big challenge, but a big of a challenge. Reg developers don't have this challenge because most of them are using Webpack directly. I think we have the same situation in the world of Vue. But here we have the Angular CLI, and the good message is the CLI is using Webpack. That's fine. The bad message is that the CLI is shielding Webpack for us. Normally, this is also a good message because no one wants to get in touch with all the details of Webpack with its huge configuration file. It's not that much fun, if you ask me. But in this very case, we want, because in this very case, we have a module federation config, and somehow we want to squeeze it into the Webpack configuration, which is shielded from us. That means we need to find a way to grab into the inner workings of the CLI and to tell Webpack underneath the covers that it needs to use this module federation config. But here we are lucky, because since the CLI 6, we have custom builders. A builder is something like an exchangeable driver. A builder takes care of building an application. For instance, if you build a traditional application, then by default, the CLI is using a Webpack builder. If you are building a library, the CLI is using an ng packager-based builder. And what we can do now is we could create a custom builder, which is taking the module federation config, which is passing it to Webpack underneath the covers. And then everything we need to do is to delegate to the default builder. The default builder that is always telling Angular CLI to build this or that application using Webpack. So we could write this by hand, of course. It would be a matter of, let's say, 50 lines of code, give or take. But you don't need to build it by hand, because I already did this for you. You can download it. The name is Angular Architects Module Federation. You can even ng add it, and this will enable module federation in your CLI 11 project. This library is doing 3 things for you. First of all, it generates the skeleton for your module federation configuration. That means you don't need to learn it by heart. You get your skeleton, you just need to fill in the lacking parts of the skeleton. Then it installs a custom builder, which is enabling module federation underneath the covers, and it assigns a new board for ngserve. This is more, of course, for debugging. This allows you to run several applications side by side, which is normally the case when going with module federation. The usage of it is quite straightforward, if you ask me. You can ng add it. After that, you need to adjust the generated configuration, and then you can ngserve it to try it out. And this is what I want to show you here in my first demonstration. So let's switch to my browser, and let's open an application I've prepared. This here is my shell application. It should be capable of loading separately compiled micro frontends, at least after we are done with it. And on localhost 3000, we find my micro frontend. This is my red micro frontend, as I call it. You can notice it by looking at the dashed red lines. And now what I want to accomplish is I want to load the micro frontend into my shell when clicking here. So let's try it out. Let's click on flights, and we see nothing. We see nothing because this hasn't been implemented yet. This is now our job during this first live coding demonstration. So if we look into the source code for this, here it is just a mono repository. It does not need to be a mono repo, but for the sake of simplicity, everything is here. But within my mono repo, everything is part of my projects folder. There is my micro frontend 1, and there is my shell. But before we look into the source code, let's have a look into the package JSON. If we scroll down here, we see I'm using Angular 11, plus I'm using the CLI 11. And the bad message is the CLI 11 is still using Webpack 4, which is quite a pity because we need Webpack 5 for module federation. It is the bad message. The good message is that the CLI 11 allows us to opt into Webpack 5. The Angular team, especially the CLI team, and some contributors did some efforts. They made sure it works more or less if we use Webpack 5 together with it. This is still experimental, so that we can start trying it out. For production use cases, it still uses Webpack 4. To force the CLI into Webpack 5, we just need those lines of code here. Those lines of code force each and every dependency into using Webpack 5 when using Yarn. That means we need to use Yarn here. This does not work with npm out of the box. Well, for npm, there is some special additional package which respects this. But if you want to have a out-of-the-box solution, a turnkey solution, then go with Yarn. This is what I did here. I already installed my dependencies with Yarn. And so I'm forced into Webpack 5. Okay, now let's switch to the console. Here I have one tab for my shell and another tab for my micro frontend. And first of all, let's enable my micro frontend for module federation. ng-add Angular architects module federation. Now the package is downloaded, and then it will ask me two questions, namely, which project do you want to enable for module federation? You know, we have a monorepo, so there are several possible projects. And the second question is, which boards do you want to use? So here I'm saying, hey, please let's enable micro frontend 1, and I want to use board 3000. Now a lot of stuff is generated for me. I'm getting the skeleton of my Webpack configuration. You don't need to worry. This is not a fully blown Webpack configuration. This is just a partial one. It only contains what we need for module federation. The rest is still generated by the Angular CLI. Within Angular JSON, we get the board number assigned and also our special builder, which is enabling module federation underneath the covers. And somehow the main file is changed. Let's have a look into the new main.ts file. You will be surprised. The main.ts file now looks like this. So I know this looks a bit special, but this is a common pattern in the world of module federation. The thing is, the main file is dynamically importing another file, the bootstrap file, and this file is taking care of bootstrapping the Angular application. So everything we would expect within main is now within Bootstrap. And this is on purpose, because this dynamic import is, as you know, asynchronous. And because it's asynchronous, it gives module federation some time for performing some other asynchronous operations in between. And those operations are deciding upon which dependencies to load. Shall I load the shared dependency from here or there? Perhaps several roles are sharing Angular core. And now the big question is, do we take mine or do we take yours? This is what takes happen here. And I'm also calling this the negotiation of shared libraries. As we will see in some minutes, those different roles, those different applications negotiate about which shared library to take. My Angular, your Angular, theirs. Something like this. Okay, this is just a pattern. You will recognize this pattern in lots of module federation-based applications. Okay, so what we did so far is adding this to our micro frontend. Let's do the same for the shell. The shell gets the board 5000, and now bang, everything is generated for us. The Webpack config and the Angular JSON is updated, and we get our main bootstrap TS track. Okay, now we can start using it. And for this, I'm switching to my source code, and here I'm starting with my micro frontend. Within here, we see I have my generated Webpack config, but you don't need to worry. It is just a partial one. See how tiny it is, only 2 pages long with this font size. And the main part of this is within the module federation plugin. This is what activates module federation within Webpack. Here we have two sections. Both of them are commented out. The first section is for remotes, for our micro frontends. The second one is for hosts, for our shell. Here we are talking about MFE1, my micro frontend one. And so let's go with the first section, which is about configuring the micro frontend one. Micro frontend gets a local name. There is a name for the remote entry point, which contains the metadata about this very micro frontend. The metadata the shell needs to know for loading it. And here I can expose stuff. So let me expose a module. It's called my flights module, flights.module.ts. I don't need this section, but I want to share stuff. I mean, yeah, I am a lonely child, but nevertheless, I like to share stuff. And that's why I'm saying, hey, I want to share my Angular with you. Before on the slides, you've seen the shorthand version of this shared section. It was just an array that looked like this. Let's share Angular core and Angular common and so on and so forth. This is the easy version. Here I'm using the more advanced version. This more advanced version allows me to configure each of those shared libraries. Here I'm saying, hey, Angular core is a singleton. That means here we are going with the Highlander principle. I guess you know the Highlander principle, there can only be one. That means if there are two different versions of Angular, two different non-compatible versions, we will get a warning. Let's say the shell is using Angular 8 and the micro frontend is using Angular 11. Because of the singleton restriction, we would get a warning. And strict version true is telling us, hey, don't just provide a warning, provide an exception instead. So this is the very strict version of doing it, saying, no, this is forbidden, it is verboten. You don't are allowed to use two different versions of Angular. Without this would be rather the Austrian kind of doing things. You know, I'm Austrian, that's why I'm allowed to pronounce it that way, to put it that way. It's something like, yeah, you know, this can be bad, but perhaps it works, who knows, let's try out. Perhaps nobody finds out. But this here is the very strict version. Okay, so I think I'm sticking with the strict version. Yeah, so as you've seen here, I can share stuff at the end of the day, and I can expose stuff for other hosts for the shell, for instance. If we look at my flight module, then we see it is a traditional Angular module with child routes. That means when I'm routing to it, I can jump to its very child routes defined in here. Okay, this is my micro frontend. At the end of the day, a traditional Angular application with a module federation config. Now let's switch back to our shell. Here we do exactly the same. If we look in here to our Webpack config that has been generated, the skeleton, we see the same entries, and the heart of it is once again the module federation plugin. I don't want to configure a remote. Now I want to configure my host. And I'm telling my host that this is a command, and I'm also telling it that I want to be capable of loading MFE1, which is, by the way, also called MFE1 over there. And this is the remote entry point where we can find it. Of course, this is very hard-coded, isn't it? This is what I'm calling static federation. And I like this for testing purposes, for debugging purposes, for demonstrations. In real world, of course, we will switch to something I'm calling dynamic federation. We will look into this during this deep dive. But first thing first, you know, first of all, we need to bake the cake. and then we can stick candles into it, not the other way around. The rest here is the same. I'm also sharing stuff, and I have configured my shared stuff. So now my shell is capable of loading stuff from over there, from the micro frontend one, just by using the URL mfe1. Now let's have a look into the shell's routing configuration. App routes, where it is, here it is. And here we can now define a dynamic route, or a lazy route, to say the least. And this lazy route looks like all the lazy routes out there in the world of Angular. We have a path, we are using load children, and we point to some URL. But the big difference here is that this URL does not exist at compile time. It only exists at runtime. At runtime, Webpack underneath the covers knows what to do with this URL. It knows, this points to the module over there within mfe1. Of course, TypeScript is not amused about this, because, you know, TypeScript is about static typing, and TypeScript is complaining because it does not know this file. It says something like, it says, hey, I don't know this file, must be a mistake. And we can now tell TypeScript, no, TypeScript, it's not a mistake. I know you don't know it, but trust me, I'm an expert. This file will exist at runtime. And to tell Webpack, we need a DTS file. The name doesn't matter. If it is called with the ending DTS, then Webpack, no, TypeScript will pick it up and respect its contents. Here I'm saying, hey, there is this module. It is not there at compile time, but trust me, it will be there at runtime. Now, as you see, TypeScript is eased, everything is fine. Okay, so one more time, a traditional Angular application using lazy loading, and by incident, Webpack underneath the covers knows how to resolve this very URL. And that should it be. So I would say, let's try it out. Here on the left side, let's start my shell again. Here on the right side, let's start my micro frontend one. Let's cross fingers so that the Temo gods are on our sides. Oh, there is already something running. Oh, it's okay. Should be okay. Yeah, you know, patience is a gift. Not my gift, but it's a gift. Yeah. Don't be bothered about those red lines here. It is just a warning. And you know, warnings are for hazards. No, honestly, as mentioned before, the integration of Webpack 5 into the CLI 11 is still experimental. Webpack 5 is stable, but the integration into the CLI is experimental. And so we need to expect some challenges. The best thing we get are warnings. Sometimes we are getting even errors. So yeah, as mentioned, it's experimental. But I think that looks good. So let us try it out. Let's switch to our application. Here I have my shell. Let's reload it. Let's click on flights. And yeah, it works. It's always a good feeling when I'm changing several files in front of a camera and if it actually works. So here we see that our micro frontend that has been compiled separately, deployed separately, is loaded on demand. And the best thing is the shell comes from a different origin, localhost 5000 versus localhost 3000. Hey, come on. Yeah, here it is. Nice. So let's also have a look to it using the network tab. Let's reload this. Let's click flights. And here you see this bundle, it is called common for some reason, is loaded on demand from over there, localhost 3000. And it's also pretty tiny, 11.6 keys. I think that proves that Angular itself is shared, because otherwise the bundle size would be far bigger. Okay, I really like this because that was not really possible before. Super good. So this was the introduction part of everything. This is what I'm showing normally to normal people. But for you, I've brought some extras. For you, I've brought my deep dive, and that's why I will proceed now with a third chapter and the fourth and the fifth and so on. And the next chapter is about dynamic module federation. If you ask me, this is quite an important topic, because somehow we do not want to know our micro frontends upfront. In the best case, we don't know nothing about our micro frontends upfront. In the best case, we get some metadata at compile time or at runtime. Perhaps we are downloading something from a lookup service, and this lookup service tells us, well, over there is this micro frontend, and here there is that brand new micro frontend. Feel free to load it. And that's why I want to get rid of this remote section. On the other side, of course, I'm exposing stuff, modules, components, and so on. And then I want to have a way to load everything dynamically, just by defining the key data at runtime, like the entry point from over there, the remote name from over there, and the name of the exposed component. This is normally not that pretty. This is just a helper function, which is delegating to the Webpack runtime API. The Webpack runtime API is quite a low-level API. It sits around in your window object when you have compiled your application with Webpack, and it allows you to do those things. After searching different objects within window and dealing with them, you can do this. So here I'm going with this helper function that is also exposed by the library I have ng added before. Okay, let's try this out. For this, let's switch to the Webpack configuration of our shell. Let me copy this, and let's get rid of our remotes, because now we do not want to know about our remotes upfront. Instead of this, I'm switching to my app routes configuration of the shell. And here I'm not using import anymore. Instead, I'm going so
Manfred, it seems that your microphone is not working anymore.
oh yeah, I was muted for some reason.
Yes, you're back. Thank you.
Great, great. Yeah, somehow my laptop was stuck and then I was muted. It's a crazy world, isn't it? But the thing is, instead of using import, I'm going with load remote module. And here I'm putting in the key data, like the exposed module, like the remote name, and like the remote entry. Well, the remote entry is the URL I've copy-pasted from the configuration. And you see, as this is just a string, we could load this dynamically from a configuration or from the server side. The remote name is MFE1, and the exposed module has the creative name /module. So perhaps we bring this in an order. I'm a little monk when it comes to this. You know, the visual monk, it needs to be in a specific order so that it makes sense. Yeah, and after loading this, we need this 10 here because the loaded TypeScript module can export several things, and here I want to go with the flights module. So this should work now, hopefully. So let's cross fingers again and let's try it out. Let's switch over to our shell. And hey, it worked. Let's do it one more time. It really worked. Now everything is really dynamic. No hard-coded barbs in our configuration anymore. But we will notice a little tiny thing when we press F12 and look at the network tab. Here, let me click flights. Okay, let me reload everything. And then let's click flights. And here we see that two things are loaded. First of all, the remote entry point, and then our micro frontend itself. That means we get two requests. First of all, the metadata, and then the micro frontend itself. Well, and the thing is, this is okay-ish, but it would be better if we loaded the remote entry point up front at the start of the application. Because the sooner my shell has all the metadata of all the micro frontends, the better it can negotiate about the shared libraries. I will come back to this in some minutes. For the time being, please remember, it is important, or it is not important, but you have benefits when loading this remote entry file upfront to have your metadata as soon as possible. And to allow this, let's comment this out here. Let's go over to our main file. And here we can import another function from Angular Architects Module Federation called load remote entry. So of course, this is asynchronous. And here we can now define our URL and the name of the micro frontend. Let me copy paste the URL because I know myself. I will mess up when I need to type it by hand. Okay. This is asynchronous. This will return, of course, a promise. And after that, let's bootstrap our application. And one more time, after that, let's catch an error if we have one. We can also catch the error before it, which means if something does not work, then at least the application is bootstrapped. If we get an error here, then we might not be capable of loading this or that micro frontend, but we can bootstrap the shell and use it perhaps a bit. Okay, now the metadata is loaded up front, and that means we can negotiate about shared libraries. What that means, we will see in some seconds. Okay, so let me try this out. Let's press F12. Let's reload it. And here we should see the remote entry point from over there. You see localhost 3000. Then I'm clicking here. Only the micro frontend itself and this beautiful picture here is loaded. Awesome. Dynamic module federation. Of course, one thing you are wondering about all the time, I know it, I can feel it, is how does module federation deal with version mismatches? Well, the thing is, it has some really clever strategies for it. Perhaps a little story. Module federation was implemented twice. It was implemented another time. It was re-implemented because the author of Webpack recognized that they need a better story for dealing with version mismatches. And one of the best features of this rewrite is that by default, module federation is going with semantic versioning. And so it can detect the highest compatible version. So let me show you an example for this. Let's say we have a shell. This is my shell. And let's say we have a micro frontend. And let's also say here we have Angular 11.0, and here we have 11.1. What happens now is Webpack is loading, hopefully, all the metadata at the beginning when the shell is started. And so it knows about the versions that are used. And now a negotiation takes happen. And within this negotiation, module federation tries to find out the highest compatible version. Well, obviously here, the highest compatible version is 11.1. 11.1 is, with regards to semantic versioning, compatible to 11.0. And so they decide to go with 11.1. If it would be the other way around, we would also get 11.1 because of this negotiation. That's fine. It's fine because we have a highest compatible version. But let's assume there is not a thing like the one and only highest compatible version. Let's say here we have 10 and there we have 11. By definition, 10 and 11 are not compatible to each other because we have two different major versions. And so the fallback is that everyone uses its own version. We can even relax this. We can say, hey, module federation, we know this one has been built with Angular 10, but trust me, it will work with Angular 11. Of course, no guarantees that it will work, but we can tell module federation to do so, and then module federation will accept Angular 11, even though this part was compiled with Angular 10. No guarantees from the Angular team, no guarantees from me. But if you try it out, if you have a sound amount of end-to-end tests, then you might find out that it works. I think chances are given because if we look at the core of Angular 9, 10, and 11, we see not much has been changed between those major versions. You can also go with a singleton. You can say, hey, there is only one version of everything. And as discussed before, you can say, if there is not one highest compatible version, if we have 10 and 11, then give me a warning or give me an error. If we get a warning, we go with the highest version, which is Angular 11. If we get an error, we go with nothing because, yeah, then the application will crash. Fail fast. I know this is a lot of theory. That's why I broke it down for you to several examples. So let's assume our shell is going with a library in the version 10. And let's say the micro frontend 1 is going with a library in the version 10.1.1. And we have a micro frontend 2, which is still using version 9. In this case, at least if we have all the metadata upfront, when the shell starts, we can do our little tiny negotiation. And as a result, the shell and MFE1 will share the highest compatible version, which is 10.1.1. And micro frontend 2 will fall back to its own version, which is 9. This is the case if we have all the metadata upfront, so we can negotiate here. But now let's assume the same scenario, but now we are using dynamic federation and we are loading the metadata far too late. That means the metadata of the micro frontend is not available when the negotiation takes happen, when the negotiation during the start of the shell takes happen. So the shell does not know that there is a higher compatible version, and so the shell will decide for Angular 10. And when the micro frontend 1 is loaded, it will decide for Angular 10.1.1, because it might not work with Angular 10. Perhaps it needs a feature that has been added with Angular 10.1, or a bug fix that has been added with Angular 10.1.1. As you see here, it is really vital to load your metadata upfront. Let me show another example. Now the shell is using 10.1.1. The micro frontend is using version 10. We are also loading everything too late. Very dynamic federation. The result is both will use 10.1.1. The shell cannot negotiate, so it takes its own. And at runtime, we will find out that 10.1 also works, even if we just need 10.0.0. Yeah, really smart, if you ask me. Really smart behavior, default behavior of module federation. So if you ask me what to do when going with dynamic federation, one option would be to make sure the shell has always the highest versions. Then you are on the safe side. Or, as mentioned several times before, just load the metadata up front, not the rest, only the metadata of all the applications, and then you have this negotiation. We've seen this before. We can define a library as a singleton. And if we set this to true, we get an error if there is not one single compatible version. Without this, we just get a warning. And this is what relaxing would look like. Here I would tell module federation, hey, here normally we needed, let's say, version 10, but I know I'm not using much of it. It will work with this version range, 1 to 11 something. Yeah, I know this is quite a tough topic, but I think with some examples in the head, one can remember those things. So one question I'm always getting after doing just an introduction into module federation is how to communicate with each other. And as we have enough time today, I can tell you how to communicate between micro frontends. The key idea is to share another library, not Angular, not the router, but your own communication library. And this own communication library could contain a communication service. Perhaps it allows to do message passing. You know, message passing is a very unobtrusive way of communicating between parts of a system. I'm sending out an event when something happens, and I'm not assuming that anyone is interested into it. Perhaps all the other parts of the system are interested. Perhaps no one is interested. I still don't know, and I do not care. I just inform, and everything who is interested can act upon this event. And yeah, this library could be a separate library, an NPM package, or it could also be part of a mono repository. In the next demonstration, I will, of course, use my mono repository. So let's have a look at it. Here I'm just stopping everything. Let's make a clean slate. And now I'm generating a library. Let's call it com. This is my communication library. Also, to use this communication library within my monorepo, I'm doing what I'm calling an X-style monorepos. Going with a path mapping. This is the wrong file. Let me switch to my dsconfig.json. Here I have a path mapping for com, and let us point to projects/com/source, and I think here we have public API. So please let me double check if this path is the right one, because I'm so clumsy, I tell you. Projects, com, source, public API. Yeah, looks good. That means every time I'm using an import for this, I will get my public API imported, which is exposing this very service here. Okay, that's good, isn't it? So let's jump into our communication service. And here I'm doing it in a very simple way, a read-only events subject. It is a new replay subject. Play it again, Sam, you know the movie. And I will recognize the last 10 events. Here it is just a string, but normally you would have a sound interface for your domain event, something like this. Interface, domain event with a name, and let's say a payload. Sorry for using any. This reminds us to DOM events. The name is click and the payload tells us if the control key has pressed or the shift key. Here I'm just going with a string instead. Okay, this is my com service. So let us jump into the shell. The shell has this app component, yes. And here within the shell, I'm getting hold of my communication service. It's called com service. Yeah, com service. I'm grabbing it and I'm sending an event out there. The event is called hello from the shell. I'm now here, I'm started. And of course, if we share this service, if we share the whole communication library, then our micro frontend should be capable of receiving this message. So let's switch to our flight search component. It's a part of our micro frontend. Please ignore the rest here. And let's inject our com service. And one more time, I'm using the com service to receive a message. Subscribe, message, console log, MFE1 got message, message. Okay, that's everything. So normally you would now publish this to NPM and share it. In our case, it's part of the mono repo, and that's why we need to tell the generated Webpack config.js about this mono repo-based library for this just added here to this array. So at this point, this plugin is doing several things behind the covers to make this work, but it's nicely abstracted, so only mention the library name here within the shell's Webpack config, and there within the micro frontend's Webpack config. That should it be. Okay, let us retry this. Let's start this. Take some time, of course. Perhaps you know Ötzi. Ötzi is the oldest Austrian. He is about 5,000 years old. He's a mummy. They found him in the mountains, in the glaciers. And no one exactly knows how he died, but my theory is he died waiting for a build back then. So don't be like Ötzi. Yeah, everything is cool here. Let's reload this. Let's click on flights. Let's press F12. Let's go to the console. And yeah, look at this. MFE1 got a message, namely hello from the shell. Let's redo it. We are reloading the shell. The shell is sending out an event and message. We are lazy loading our flights micro frontend, and hey, it gets our message. This is how to share messages, to share data. Don't overdo it. Limit it to a minimum, because communicating is coupling parts to each other. And this is all about reducing coupling. Nice. So I have 2 chapters left for you. I hope you have some energy. The next thing is also something I'm asked a lot, because in some companies, people want to mix and match, let's say, different versions of Angular, and perhaps they want to mix and match Angular with React. Obviously, there are several drawbacks when doing this, like bundle sizes. You need to load Angular 8, Angular 9, Angular 10, Angular 11. Obviously, this is not a good idea when we talk about tiny bundle sizes. But it seems to be that there is a need for this. At least several companies I'm working with telling me they have the need for this, and at least they want to evaluate the options for this. The key idea here is to expose a web component via module federation. That means you don't expose an Angular module, you don't expose a component, you expose a web component. And obviously, when going with Angular, you can create this web component with Angular elements. As mentioned, the bundle size is a big issue here, because you need to download all those versions and frameworks. And besides this, you also need some additional workarounds. It's doable. I've helped several companies build systems like this. But as always, when it comes to architecture, you need to know about your trade-offs. There are always some trade-offs, and then you can decide. In the example I will show you now, I have a shell. I have 3 micro frontends, MFE1, MFE2, MFE3. The shell and MFE1 are sharing one Angular version, MFE2 and MFE3 sharing another Angular version, and MFE4 is using React. So let's have a look into this. For this, let me close my example here. I thank you, my friend. Let's go to my Marty example and let's start it. So here I'm using Learner to start all my applications side by side at the same moment. It gives me a colorful output. I love it. Perhaps you know Learner. It's one of the more heavyweight solutions for mono repositories. What I did before was more of the lightweight solution. Okay, yeah, no, we need to start 5 applications, so this takes some time. Okay, nothing happens anymore. That's hopefully a good sign. So let's try it out. Localhost 4200. Here we go. This is our shell. Perhaps you recognize this beautiful web design. And you see here the shell is using Angular 11 RC2. I just needed to have several versions. Micro Frontend 1 is also using Angular 11 RC2. So Angular 11 RC2 is shared between the shell and Micro Frontend 1. And here we even have some routes. When we look at Micro Frontend 2, this is another web component using RC0. you know, it works since version 11. So I needed to just grab different versions within 11. And here within Micro Frontend 3, I'm also using RC0. So RC0 is shared between those two of them. And here we have this framework with the Atom React. And yeah, this is using a specific React version. So I'm mixing and matching different frameworks and versions here. And this only works because I have wrapped all those micro frontends into web components. Let us have a tiny look into the source code. For instance, let us close here everything. And let's move to micro frontend 1. Here we have our app module. And well, it's a traditional app module. It declares some components and some routes. And those lines of codes is what we need for wrapping our component as a web component. Perhaps you've seen this before. It's Angular elements. I'm using the injector. I'm calling create custom element. I'm passing in my Angular component and the injector, and I'm getting out a web component. And then this web component is registered with the browser under this name. It is really registered with the browser. That means the browser takes care of rendering this element. Every time the browser sees something like this, our Angular element, our web component will be rendered. And because the browser takes care of it, I can use it together with each and every framework out there. If we look to the module federation config of MFE1, we see that I'm exposing my bootstrap TS. You remember the bootstrap TS is calling the main TS. The main TS is bootstrapping our app module. And as we have seen before, the app module in turn is declaring our web component. We are exposing this, and so we get here our web component. And by the way, Angular core and the rest is shared, at least if someone else is using the same major version, then we will share it with them. On the other side, within my shell, I'm just routing to a wrapper component. You see it here. For MFE1, I'm routing to my wrapper component. For MFE2, I'm routing to my wrapper component. For MFE3 and MFE4, exactly, I'm routing to my wrapper component. So it's quite a tongue twister, isn't it? Routing to a wrapper component, try to say it 10 times in a very fast way. It's always the same component, but it's always configured in a different way with this property. And what this data property is doing here, it tells about the micro frontend and about the element name. And then at runtime, I'm importing the web component from there, and I'm creating an element with this tag name. This is what happens inside the wrapper component. This allows me to route to my web components, even though the router is not capable of it. Also, those web components might use routing. And that's why I'm not using here an URL. Instead, I'm using a path matcher, an URL matcher, which tells the router, well, everything that starts with MFE1 leads to this wrapper component with this configuration. And then it is up to the loaded web component what it does with the rest of the URL. Here, I'm just going with a URL matcher. This is one of the workarounds I've told you about. Yeah, so you see it here, it's possible, but think twice before you do it, because yeah, it's a bit more heavyweight. You need some workarounds like wrapper components, like path matches. Perhaps you're saying, well, I like all of this, but I don't need micro frontends. Is there another reason why I should go with module federation? And yeah, there is another reason. You could use it to build plug-in systems, because no one forces you into exposing micro frontends with module federation. You can expose literally everything, components, functions, classes, everything. And this allows you to extend an existing system without recompiling it. It can just load plugins from there, from here, and so on. To demonstrate this, I've built a workflow designer. And here, only the workflow designer is part of our solution. The workflow tasks are plugins loaded from a different origin by means of module federation. That means I can extend it with new tasks without the need to rebuild the workflow designer, which is especially important if the workflow designer is, let's say, is a software as a service product. Perhaps this customer has licensed the download task. Another customer gave us some additional sheets of paper, and so they can also use the upload task. So let's have a look into this last demonstration for today. Get rid of this. Let me jump into the workflow example. Windows terminal. Let me ng-serve the shell. Let me ng-serve my first plugin. I'm calling it micro frontend 1, but as a matter of fact, it's a plugin. And let's call it. And let's call or serve my second plugin, my second micro frontend. Okay, let's take some time. Yeah, this is our workflow designer. This is here my first plugin. My first plugin, it exposes those two tasks over localhost 3000. And here you have somewhere my second plugin. So let me close everything we don't need. Yeah, here we have my second plugin. It provides those two tasks as plugins. And when the shell is started, it only gets this configuration here. This configuration that is telling the shell, well, today you can find a task called download over there. This is the remote entry. This is the name of the remote. And this is the name of the exposed module, which is here an Ivy component. The same is true for upload. This is the remote entry, it's the same. This is the remote name, but it's called over there. And this is the exported module, which in turn exports another Ivy component. And the same is true for stuff we get from localhost 3001. So this is just read at runtime. And then this example is using dynamic federation, as you have seen it before, to add our tasks dynamically from here and there. Well, the thing is, this was a case study for a customer of mine who is doing stuff like this, who is providing a software as a service solution, which is a workflow designer. Of course, this workflow designer they build is a bit more powerful than this here. Here I'm just dynamically inserting Ivy components. You get the source code of this, so you can look up all the details. Yeah, super good. Perhaps you like this. Perhaps you say, hui, this is the missing link to our architecture. Finally, we can be that flexible without lots of dirty workarounds. When can we have it? The answer is Webpack 5 is final. Webpack 5 is here, so feel free to use it. Also, CLI 11 is final, so feel free to use it. But as mentioned before, the integration of Webpack 5 into the CLI is experimental. That's why you will run into pitfalls. That's why you will get some warnings. Here you will get the slides afterwards. You have a GitHub page where all the open issues are recorded of the integration. And here I have also documented some additional pitfalls. That means you can use it now for experimenting, for creating your hypothesis. You know, an architecture is very often a hypothesis that needs to be proved with code. And you can try it out. You can start with this micro frontend and with that micro frontend, work on it in isolation. And you know that at some point in the future, you will get a sound integration with, I guess, CLI 12, which is due this spring. So it's not that long. It's about 5 months or something like this. And then you can integrate your micro frontends. Until then, my recommendation is play around with it, integrate them for the time being with hyperlinks, and then integrate them with a sound solution with CLI 12, Webpack 5, and module federation. Well, if you like this talk, you will perhaps also like my free ebook. 2 weekends ago, I've updated it for module federation. Now it consists of, I think, 4 chapters describing everything I've shown you so far and a bit more. And yeah, you can get it for free from here, angulararchitects.io/book. So let me come to a conclusion. We've seen several things today. We've seen that module federation is really a game changer because it allows us to load separately deployed and compiled code at runtime, which is the key for micro frontends. We can use this together with Angular by leveraging this tiny plugin. We can do everything dynamically at runtime. That means we don't need to know about our stuff upfront. It can deal perfectly with version mismatches. And if we use some workarounds, some tricks, if we use, let's say, web components, we can even create a multi-framework, multi-version scenario. Also, we have seen this is not only good for micro frontends, we can even use it for a plugin system like my workflow designer. And then is one last thing. There is one last thing I want you to remember. If you forget about everything, please always remember this one thing, namely, now it's the time to become the next Leonardo da Vinci. So take your chance. Now you even have all the material to implement your beautiful design. Take your chance to become the next Leonardo. So thanks for having me. Here you find my contact data. I have already uploaded my slides to my blog. And if you like, follow me on Twitter to keep a bit contact. So thanks for this.
Wow, this was amazing. Thank you so much, Manfred. Really, really awesome. This will enable us all to try and become the next Leonardos. I've never seen anyone run so many applications at the same time in one talk. So this is was really mind-blowing. and can't think about the possibilities. This sounds truly endless. So really amazing. The chat is also blowing up. We have a chat on YouTube. We have a chat on Facebook. Many questions are coming in. So Sam, do you want to put some of the questions on the screen here? So first question is micro frontend different than components?
Well, I would say a micro frontend is an application of its own, and we can load it into a bigger application, into a shell application. Because the user is not interested into having 50 separate applications. So for the user, it must look like one integrated solution. But we as developers are interested into it because it allows us to scale over teams. One team can work on this, one team can work on that, and they don't need to coordinate each other. They don't need to slow each other down all the time.
Got it. Someone else asked about different Angular versions, but you tackled that one already, which is handled really gracefully. So thank you, Maarten, for asking that question. Then we have another one. How do you handle CSS clashes between remote plugins? Yeah, interesting one.
Yeah, that's an interesting question because there are different answers to it. So you have really different opportunities. One possibility would be to share a design library. Let's say you have a design library with your design system and you just share it. Of course, if you share it, you have a lot of consistency because everything looks the same way automatically. But on the other side, sharing stuff brings in some dependencies and coupling because now you are coupled to a very specific version of this library. And so some people try to get rid of this dependency by just sharing a logical design system. They are defining some tokens, and so each and every team has the maximum of flexibility. They can decide by themselves how to implement this design system, how to implement those design tokens. And there are some solutions in between, something like inner sourcing, which means there are some CSS files or SAS files shared internally, and you can use it as is, or you can take it and you can just fork it and adjust it to your needs. So you have the best of both worlds. You are not slowed down because of depending upon a shared library, and you can do your pull requests. So it's up to you. You have those possibilities, and at the end of the day, it's a trade-off between consistency and flexibility. You can get both for 100%.
Yep, got it. Makes sense. Thank you, and thank you. Great question. Another question. This one came in via the Facebook page. So can the concept of dynamic module federation also work in a server node environment? You mentioned a decorated window object for in browsers. Would that also work in a node context?
Yeah, that's one of the best things. So because it's baked into Webpack, it also works with server-side rendering. Because the application does not even notice at all that there separately compiled remote is loaded. It just looks like lazy loading. So I'm always saying, if it works with lazy loading, it works with module federation. The last example is a bit critical, where I used web components, because, you know, web components and server-side rendering, yeah, it might work, but you need some additional workarounds like Puppeteer or removing Shadow DOM on the server side. So this might be a bit tricky, but all the rest, where we don't go with web components, works perfectly with server-side rendering, and it has even been tested with server-side rendering heavily. It was one of their use case when they built it.
Wow, that's amazing. Eh? Really great news. All right. Next question. What about authentication? Yeah, they keep coming in. So there's a lot of questions from all over the world here. So that's really, really awesome. What about authentication in OpenID Connect or OAuth 2? Shall handle code flow, I presume, but what about the HTTP interceptor that passes the access token?
Yeah, So the first thing is using token-based authentication makes sense because you can easily share your token. You could also bundle everything through the same origin. Then it would even work with HTTP-only cookies, but using tokens is more flexible for sure. Just share it with your message bus or with your session storage. There are a lot of opinionated discussions if the session storage is okay or not, but let me just say you share it somehow, the token. And the other question is, what's with the HTTP interceptor? So the thing is, if you share Angular, then you have one HTTP interceptor, and yeah, this will do the heavy lifting for you.
Wow, that's awesome. Eh? So yeah, basically by sharing Angular, you also have the same dependency injection. You have the same singleton HTTP service.
Yeah, totally. So it's really the same as lazy loading from Angular's perspective.
Wow. I think everyone is blown away by, whoa, this is awesome. It can do so much. Someone asked, have you ever run into issues when things starting up in the wrong order? Like if you put in, or is it just okay to be running at the point where you need to load the browser page?
If you go with static module federation, then you need to start everything in the right order, at least within your browser. If it is more dynamic, you can do your own retries. So if it is not there, then you can try to load it and load it again, something like this.
Okay, got it. And greetings from Denver, Colorado, apparently. So that's really, really awesome. Thanks for joining from over Denver.
Yeah, greetings back to Denver. I know Michael, at least from Twitter. You know, those times we know our profile pictures. And so I remember Michael Graham.
Awesome. Thank you for joining, Michael. Next question. Have you run into cache issues yet when loading micro frontends? So if you load them,
not really, because even with micro frontends, you still use hash values as part of your file names. And so you don't have those issues.
Yeah. So they automatically cache busts. And yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and great questions, all. Next question is, when using micro frontends in NX, do you have an approach for sharing typings if component services exposed by remotes so that they are properly consumed by hosts? So first of all, maybe is it because we saw like Angular monorepo? Is this working also in NX, the schematics that you wrote? It's compatible?
Yeah, it's tested with both. It works with both. And yeah, you need some shared library with typings with DTS files.
Okay.
That's
it.
So
it is doable there. Wow. And then a lot of feedback. Really cool. Nicely done, Manfred.
thank you.
Someone asked, can we pass props for communication? I guess anything can be passed, right? If you have a communication service that... so can't we pass as props for communication? I'm not sure if that's in the context of the Angular component, the React component there, or if it's between the different micro frontends.
Yeah, so it works in all the cases. If not everything is Angular, you need to go with a shared, let's say, ECMAScript object. If it is Angular, if everything is Angular, you could share a service, a singleton.
Got it. All right. So everyone is throwing thank you at you, Manfred. A lot of claps, a lot of celebrations here. Really awesome. Thanks for this awesome session indeed. And thanks for going so in depth. I do have some personal questions left here on the Module Federation. But before I ask them, do any of the panelists here have any other questions?
I have one. It's more related to the monorepos. It's like I have a bit of feeling with the Module Federation. It's like the next step in monorepos is like you can start with one application, but you can, like with the plugin system, you can throw anything at it. You don't need to actually start with a monorepo anymore. You can just add stuff in there. And of course, yeah, building a monorepo is still maybe something to do, but it feels like it's not the necessity anymore. It's like if you want to, you can just add plugins in your code base and maintain it. and pull it out if need be. But where do you see the combination of a monorepo and then module federation going?
Yeah, that's a very good question. The thing is, there are a lot of hard feelings out there about this topic and a lot of emotions out there. People are fighting over this topic. Are we allowed to use micro frontends with a monorepo? And I'm saying, of course we are allowed, because no one can prevent us from doing it. And it has really some advantages. For instance, sharing libraries is easy. And you always have the newest version of all the libraries available without npm publish and npm install. On the other side, if you have different repositories, then you have more flexibility, because you can use Angular 8 here and Angular 11 there and React something over there. So this gives you more freedom, but this freedom comes with cost, because now you need to publish your shared libraries over NPM. You need to make sure that your Angular libraries work with all the supported Angular versions. And there is a gap between your Angular versions, and you are postponing upgrading to the newest Angular versions. And I've tried it out. Postponing doesn't make it easier. It makes it far more difficult. That is the drawback here. So at the end of the day, you need to know what is more valuable for you. Don't having the costs or having all the freedom out there. If you are not sure, I'm recommending to start with a monorepo and to start with NX, because NX has this cool feature of access restrictions. You can say, hey, this vertical is not allowed to talk with that vertical. And so you can reach quite easily one of the goals of micro frontends, which is isolation. And because of those access restrictions, you can refactor to multiple repositories later. Chances are high you will find out you don't need it. And the nice thing about this is you start with a lean solution, but you make sure you can switch to a more advanced solution later if you need it. And for me, this is a sign of a good architecture, because this prevents you from over-engineering. You do everything at the least reasonable moment, and you start lean.
Thank you very much.
Was quite a long answer. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
We didn't get into a fight, so that's nice.
Yeah.
Thank you for the question too, Maarten. It sounds like the entire world becomes a playground with module federation. So that's really, really cool. We have one new question coming in as well. So FE Stack asks, how do we handle translation module if it's used in both host and remote?
I guess you refer to nginx translate. So in this case, I would do the same as with lazy loading. You can import it everywhere using for_child, and for_child can point to this or that translation file for this very lazy module.
Yeah, sounds like everything is possible. It sounds too good to be true.
Yeah, there needs to be some catch somewhere. I need to find it. There needs to be a catch.
Matt or Yannick, do you have any questions left before we? No? Oh, good. Sam, do you have any questions left?
Well, the question about running it on the server side was my question. So thank you very much for answering that.
Welcome.
I do a lot with server-side rendering with Angular.
I know.
So I would need to check. I would need to try it out a bit, because I haven't had the chance yet to play with it. So it looks very interesting, and you really triggered me to take a deeper look now.
Cool.
Absolutely.
So I guess we will see a prototype upcoming in the next days, or a blog article or something like this.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope that I get the energy again to start writing a bit more. It's been a while.
Okay, yeah, it takes energy. That's true.
Maybe I have one. If I have an application that leverages service workers, should I have one per model federated, or should I have one in the shell that handles everything?
Yeah, you need one in the shell because this is what is loaded from the browser's perspective. Everything else is just loaded on demand from here and there. So you need your own service worker. And I doubt that Angular service worker will work in this very scenario. I really love Angular service worker because it's a nice turnkey solution, but also it wants to know about everything upfront. Everything that is cacheable needs to be known upfront in this service worker JSON file. So, sorry, I guess you need to go with a handwritten service worker or with Workbox, something like this.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, fascinating question. Looking at the other question.
Maybe a very stupid question is like the naming of module federation always threw me off. And do you know why they call it this? Is it like the federation of states and then like the federation of JavaScript or TypeScript packages that is being brought together, that name is there?
Yeah, I guess that's the reason. Honestly, I didn't question the name, but this is what also came in mind. Something like the Federation of States, like, you know, if you look to Germany, it consists of several different states which have a lot of rights. They can do their own education system, for instance. And we have the same situation in Austria and in the Switzerlands. And over there, in the United States of America, I guess.
Okay,
I think that's the origin of the name, but I haven't questioned it.
No.
Got it. Yeah, I think to federate is like to all the modules together form an alliance to form one app, I guess, right? But yeah, good question. Thank you, Maarten. I also had 12 questions, of which 10 are already answered. So that's really, really awesome. Thank you, Manfred. 2 of them are left. So I was wondering, is there, like, suppose that you start using this, investing time in this, is there a risk that module federation breaks in upcoming versions of Angular and Webpack? Not in the sense like, okay, it needs to be fixed, but that is no longer supported. Is this something we can already actively...
I don't think so. So the Angular team itself is really keen into Webpack 5 because it not only brings module federation, it is also faster and has more possibilities for optimizing the code. So the source code becomes smaller. And it is really faster in terms of compiling everything because it has a build cache. And so the Angular team really loves it. And that's why they want to incorporate it into the CLI. When it only comes to module federation within Webpack, I have talked to the founder of Webpack, and he does not plan big changes, neither big changes nor big additional features. So he thinks it is more or less done. The feature is done. And he has some ideas for tiny additions, for tiny improvements, but nothing that's really big.
Got it. Yeah, faster builds. Who doesn't want that, right? So it's
yeah.
Utsi would have liked that. Then module federation requires Angular 11 and Webpack 5. Does it also require a modern browser? Can this be run on older browsers, or do you need?
Yeah, it can even run in IE 11 or something like this, because from the browser's perspective, it is only about creating a dynamic script tag at the right time and taking what's loaded from there and dealing with it. So it's not a big deal from the browser's perspective.
Got it. All right. Yeah, it looks like we have all the questions answered. So thank you so much, Manfred, for this amazing talk. We were all blown away by these new possibilities. Some of us already saw parts of the module federation, but this was really in depth and learned a lot. So really, really appreciate it. Before we jump off, where can people learn more about you? Is there anything you would like to request our audience or the Angular community in general?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter, or you can find me and my work in my blog and website. I'm copy pasting it to the chat, the private one. Perhaps you can relay it to the public one. So if anyone needs something, feel free to reach out. Find me on Twitter and on my blog.
Wow, perfect. And thank you for the free ebook. I guess we all know what to read now over Christmas. We really appreciate this and read over it again. Final question, Manfred. In the most famous Austrian accent sentence ever expressed by one of your fellow Austrian giants, Mr. Schwarzenegger,
yeah,
back at NGBE.
I'll be back.
Thanks everyone for joining. We hope you had a great time and learned something new about Module Federation. Have an awesome day. Enjoy the holidays and stay safe. See you in the next episode. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Danke wel.